Last week, you'll recall, we talked about sort of basic patterns, basic state functions, particularly with regard to economic policy. And you'll recall that, our basic matrix looked a little bit like this. That in a system that combines democracy and capitalism, that is, civil liberties, or politics based on equal rights and civil liberties, and a economic system based on free markets, you draw much of the state's attention to managing the market, and particularly to managing particular things that the market neglects to do, doesn't do very well. And so we tried to sort of categorize basic state responses. What I want to do today is basically a sort of leisurely stroll through the 20th century to look how this plays out in basic patterns of policy that cut across a number of, I think, sort of important policy eras. It's much more useful, as I'll lay out tonight, to think about these sort of characteristic eras, these bundles of policies, than it is to think of, say, going from one presidential administration to the next. Those patterns depend somewhat on the business cycle. Because state functions are, so much of their attention is drawn towards managing the market. Of course, responding to a recession or managing a boom is a major issue for public policy. And this gives you just a sort of quick and dirty sketch since 1929, when we started measuring this carefully, of the sort of ups and downs in the business cycles. Of course, we have the Great Depression, we have recession after World War II, a couple of small dips during the 1950s, a fairly severe downturn after the Vietnam War, the sort of double dip recession of the early 1980s, a couple of small downturns, and then, of course, our current economic woes. So the red line here is gross domestic product, roughly the size of the economy, and you can see each time it dips, we have that sort of characteristic of the business cycle. In terms of catalysts for public policy and public policy innovation, what's also important is war. Particularly across the 20th century, what we find, there are moments of policy innovation in the wake of the Civil War, during World War I, probably most dramatically during World War II, which, as I'll come to in a moment, sort of galvanizes the New Deal. Korea, Vietnam, even our more recent wars, have major effects on policy, sometimes just by setting limits on what can be done because of the larger fiscal situation. And of course, alongside the sort of boom and bust, making markets work stuff, you have to pay attention to the unemployment rate. And you can see here, going back to 1890 to the present, peaking during the Great Depression. Again, you can see peaking up during those economic downturns, and again, peaking up sharply during our most recent downturn. If we want to break this into sort of characteristic eras of public policy, again, decade by decade or administration by administration is not terribly useful, because I think it's the background issues, the business cycle, that's really driving things. So I find the most useful way to look at it is a little bit like this. You have a period at the end of the 19th century, which historians often call the Gilded Age, a name coined by Mark Twain. Oops. Following that, you have what's commonly known as the Progressive Era, roughly from the beginning of the century to the American entry into World War I. For our purposes, the Progressive Era will include World War I. So it runs to about 1920. Then you have a sort of brief boomlet, what's often called the Roaring 1920s, which of course ends spectacularly in 1929. And then you get the response to the Great Depression, generically known as the New Deal. The New Deal, was 1932 to 41, really till 45, till the end of the war. Then you get the post-war era, that sort of dramatic boom on the back of the international standing of the U.S. in the world. The Great Society, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson attempt to sort of expand on the New Deal, but to expand on the New Deal, as we'll see, just at a time when the national state is facing fairly severe fiscal limits, because this is coming contemporaneous with spending on the Vietnam War. So that's followed by what economists of the period often call the zero-sum society, by which they mean The economy is no longer growing. We're no longer saying, well, what kind of safety net? How are we going to distribute the fruits of growth? How are we going to distribute the pain of decline? And so the logic of zero sum is, you can't give anybody anything without taking it away from somebody else. And so the battles become more divisive over things like affirmative action and welfare. And then I think the most conservative, or the most recent period, is most usefully dubbed the conservative ascendant, from Reagan on, in which I would include, the Clinton administration, because both parties move in that direction. So these are the eras that I want to sort of capture tonight. What I want to do is just sort of pull up each one, talk about the background characteristics, try and highlight important changes and important concerns that were nested within each of these. Any questions? Okay, so let's start with the end of the 19th century. Perhaps the most important feature of this period, coming in the wake of the Civil War, is it's a period of fairly dramatic economic growth. Economic growth and population growth, because beginning in the 1880s, picking up in the 1890s, you get a large-scale movement of Europeans from Eastern and Western European into the United States. And as you can see, particularly marked by a dramatic rise in manufacturing output. Running alongside this, you have really some important innovations, part technological, part legal. You have the emergence of what we would come to know as mass production, the assembly line model, which begins, as in this illustration, with steam-driven pulleys and belts running from overhead. But with the advent of electricity, of course, will be sort of released from that, yielding, of course, the Henry Ford's innovation of the modern assembly line in the teens. But running alongside that, which involves a really dramatic increase in the scale of manufacturing, is the sort of legal invention of the modern corporation, the idea of a limited liability corporation composed of multiple divisions that's protected under the law as if it were an individual, making it much easier, among other things, to raise the money that you need to increase the scale of manufacturing. Corporate law and the law of incorporation, interestingly enough, remains a state function. And still today, states compete over incorporation requirements, with states like New Jersey and Delaware famously trying to sort of get to the bottom and attract as much investment as they can. This was also a period of consolidation of the national economy, in part made possible by the end of the Civil War, because it stitched North and South together in a single national economy in a way that didn't exist before. I mean, for much of the early 19th century, the South, or a large chunk of the South, used a different railroad gauge than the North. You didn't take rolling stock across the Mason-Dixon line. But you get this dramatic sort of consolidation, also going back to our sort of matrix of concerns that we drew last day, a huge investment in public goods, in the building of the railroad infrastructure. Of course, this is made possible by investment in railroads, by the advance in manufacturing, but also by the reunion of North and South, and the emergence of what magazines celebrated at the time as the New South. That is, a South based on free labor, a South in which you would see new manufacturing investment. The South is slow to industrialize and remains a sort of agricultural backwater of the Northeast in some respects. But it aggressively begins going after industry, partly trying to compete on the basis of wages and bring particularly textile and clothing manufacturers south in an attempt to industrialize and compete with the North. This was also an era marked by protectionism. That is, high tariffs, keeping manufactured goods produced in other countries, primarily Europe, out in order to protect the development of American manufacturing. Protectionism, of course, is a luxury for a country that has a growing population and a growing economy, because it can, in a sense, sell to itself. As we'll see, the fascination with protectionism begins to wane in the early years of the 20th century when American manufacturing, which grows so impressively, begins outgrowing the domestic market, and some important sectors of the economy are looking to trade abroad. But for the moment, the basic doctrine is keep the borders closed to the influx of most manufactured goods in order to protect domestic manufacture. And it was a volatile economy. Not surprisingly, given the virtual absence of any sort of national management of the economy, of the money supply, of interest rates, of regulation of basic industry, none of that is in place. So it suffers some of the vicissitudes of private markets that we talked about last day. A certain amount of short-sightedness, concentrations of economic power, inequality, and a fairly volatile business cycle, a boom and bust cycle. The political concerns of this era were fairly straightforward. And again, drawing on our earlier lecture, one of these was concentrations of economic power, because with the increased scale of economic activity came large combinations. What's pictured here is the Standard Oil octopus or combination. The fear, of course, was that you have an inequality in the market, you have a buyer, or a seller in this case, which is much more powerful than the distributed buyers. You have an inequality, prices or supply and demand are not reaching equilibrium, but it's an abuse of economic power. And this is seen, as we stressed last day, not only as a problem for markets, but in a democratic setting as a problem for politics as well, because concentrated economic power has political influence. And so here in the smaller grayscale image, the snake of monopoly is threatening Lady Liberty, a common image from the end of the 19th century. So that was considered a problem in national politics. It was also considered a problem in local and state politics, the problem of boss rule. So here we have this sort of famous image of Boss Tweed, the head of the Democratic machine in New York City, at Tammany Hall. And again, a sort of common image here of the U.S. Senate, although you can't quite read it. The senators there are named, the Beef Trust, the Steel Trust, the Sugar Trust. Again, this fear, this anxiety that concentrated economic power is corrupting politics. Also concerns with labor unrest, or sort of broadly with the problem of political and economic equality. The labor movement certainly felt that economic growth was coming often on the backs of workers. And what's interesting in these great labor disputes, and I'm thinking here, the Homestead strike of the 1890s, the big steel strike, or the Haymarket affair a little bit later, the confrontation was often between two different conceptions of political and economic right, where, of course, Andrew Carnegie, in his famous Gospel of Wealth, argued that property rights were paramount, and that the American Constitution was designed to protect property rights, and that his success should be honored and protected. Those who felt, that Carnegie was one of those snakes threatening Lady Liberty would counter that individual rights were being trampled by that fascination with property rights. So a concern, remember, we tried to evoke last day, a tension between economic inequality, which is accepted by a market system, and political inequality, which is expected by a democratic system. This was mirrored by unrest on the farm, marked particularly by the emergence of the populist movement in the 1890s. And here again, it's both a concern with equality, but also with the proper operation of market, because the problem that farmers faced was that it was the opposite of the sort of Standard Oil problem. There were many, many sellers, as many sellers of wheat as there were wheat farmers, but relatively few buyers. So farmers couldn't control the prices fell, they felt they were under the thumb of banks and grain elevators, the railroads who owned the grain elevators. One of the most famous commentaries on populism is Frank Baum's 1890 comic novel, The Wizard of Oz, in which all of the imagery is sort of from that populist unrest. So the scarecrow is the farmer, the tin man is the worker, and neither of them can accomplish anything. They're trying to get to the Emerald City, which is, of course, Washington, D.C. They're following the Yellow Brick Road, which is a metaphor for the gold standard, the sort of currency standard of the 1890s. The farmers wanted to use a silver standard, which was expand the money supply. And in Baum's book, of course, Dorothy wears silver slippers that she claps together in order to get where she wants. They changed them to ruby slippers for the movie. And then, of course, you have the Wicked Witch of the West, which is the climate that farmers face, the Wicked Witch of the East, which is the Eastern Banks. The Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, who was the standard bearer for the Populist Party in 1890. And finally, on this era, you have a legal environment in which pretty much the summary assessment would be that the Commerce Clause rule. So I asked you to read a little bit background on the Commerce Clause for tonight. Basically, that's the clause of the Constitution, which in fairly straightforward, if at times vague language, says, here's what Congress can do, meaning here's what the national government can do. Everything else is for the state. And so at the time in the 1890s, there was little doubt that the federal government could do what was specified under the Commerce Clause, which was manage interstate commerce. So what's the federal government do? They have an Interstate Commerce Commission. They manage the railroad. They manage tariff, maritime trade, that sort of thing. Things that clearly and physically cross state lines. But in this case, in 1895, the Justice Department, under the new Antitrust Act, went after a monopoly in sugar manufacturing, where most of the sugar companies, most of which were located in the Philadelphia area, had combined, and they had a basic monopoly on production. And what the Supreme Court said at the time was, it's manufacturing. It's all happening in Pennsylvania. That's not interstate commerce. Once it starts moving across state line, if there's one company that shipped it all over the country, that would violate antitrust, or that would come to the attention of the federal government. But this is up to the state. So you have a legal environment in which federal responsibility for the working and the regulation of the economy is fairly minimal and kept at bay by constitutional interpretation. Any questions? Okay. Move into the 20th century. The next roughly 20-year period is often characterized as the progressive era. Progressives, that is the reformers of the era, came from a wide variety of backgrounds. Didn't necessarily correspond to what we think of as progressive today. There were religious reformers, there were sort of business efficiency experts, there was an ascendant labor movement, all sorts of interests at play, and I'll try and touch on some of those. What were then the sort of characteristics and concerns of the progressive era? Perhaps the easiest way to think about this era is to think about it as a response to industrialization, as a response to those changes of the late 19th century. A discovery, in effect, of some of what we called last day the externalities, right? Those things that the market creates but doesn't really take care of. One of these is wages and working conditions. Long hours, low wages, child labor, working women, which is generally seen as a problem at the time. These were prominent in the attention of progressive reformers. As were urban conditions. So this illustration is taken from, the sort of famous investigations of Jacob Riis and others, who walked the streets of cities like Chicago and documented dismal living conditions, poor land use planning, bars, side churches, and that sort of thing. Recognizing the fact that, in the American political fabric, in the constitutional makeup, there's no mention of cities anywhere. There's no mention of how cities will operate. And in fact, well into the 20th century, cities are basically run by the states in which they're in. If Cincinnati wants a sewer system, the state of Ohio has to pass a law to give Cincinnati a sewer system. So cities don't run themselves in the way they would in the latter part of the 20th century. So you get unplanned land use, very poor sanitary conditions, and of course problems of tenement living. And this is coming, of course, at the same time as massive immigration. So many see it as a problem that can be attributed to the immigrants themselves. Oh, it's the fault of the Irish or the Jews. This is the way they live. And so it's accompanied by campaigns for Americanization. Language skills, that sort of thing. The progressives were also fascinated with what they called social insurance. That is as the cartoon with the umbrella suggests, of establishing broader protections for workers. Not so much in the sort of safety net sense that we use today for sort of broad-based social programs. The idea here was to attach to a job protections for the worker, things like workers' compensation, health insurance if that worker got sick, although the health insurance they talked about at the time was not like contemporary health insurance, it was just covering lost wages. Sickness insurance, unemployment insurance, pensions, these sorts of things. Again, because the federal government under the Commerce Clause is relatively weak, because the states have few resources, the idea is to sort of leverage this in workplaces, to get employers to provide these. So many of the plans of progressives were to have, the worker and the employer and the state each put aside, 1/3 of the cost of, say, funding a pension for that worker when they retire. As I've already suggested, progressives were also concerned with the problem of immigration, which was a problem of assimilation, it was a problem of urban conditions, it was a problem of working conditions. And increasingly, as we moved towards World War I, it was seen as a political problem as well. Because many immigrants, in the eyes of some progressive reformers, were irredeemable radicals. Which is one reason why World War I chokes off immigration. There's sort of mass deportations at the end of the war, and then very strict immigration restrictions in the early 1920s that last into the middle 1960s. Progressive era is also marked by a retreat from protectionism. Again, as I suggested earlier, precisely because the American economy is outgrowing its market, key elements of that very successful manufacturing economy are now saying, we want to sell outside our borders. But of course, American producers can't sell in Europe or South America or elsewhere without some mutual consideration, without bringing tariffs down on the American side as well. So over a relatively short period of time, and culminating at least temporarily, or at least briefly in the World War I era, the United States becomes an ardent advocate of free trade. This is particularly true of the regime of Woodrow Wilson from 1912 to 1920. Wilson is an ardent free trader and sees both the outbreak of World War I and the failure to establish a lasting peace as consequences of a failure of free trade. The old idea, which is a favorite of, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times today, that countries that trade with each other will never go to war, is sort of rooted in this early 20th century moment. Progressives also became interested in worker and consumer safety, going back to those information problems that we identified last day. That is the role of the state to sort of step in and say, is this patent medicine safe? What grade is this meat? Kind of thing. And so it's in the progressive era in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the forerunner of today's Food and Drug Administration. That you get the first federal attempt to sort of regulate trade practices and advertising claim and things like that. And of course, the era is notable for moral reform as well, particularly for the passage of prohibition at the end of the era, 1919, 1920, which lasts into the 1930s. This is an interesting example because it's one of the few marked successes in terms of past legislation of the Progressive era, and it comes through a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's one way around the Commerce Clause. But it also captures, I think, the fundamentally sort of schizophrenic nature of progressivism, because this kind of reform, of course, is fundamentally conservative. And so again, the Progressive era is somewhat misnamed if its most, dramatic and lasting legacy is banning beer. This is a policy environment which is also shaped in different ways by the emergence of new forms of mass media, particularly mass market magazines. Muckraking by weekly magazines is a sort of important push to antitrust, to concern about the fate of cities. Realist novels like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposes conditions in meatpacking, are also part of this tradition. But as I suggested all along, the Progressive era, one more thing. You also have, a couple more things. You also have in the Progressive era, reflecting that immigration boom, a fairly substantial pattern of local radicalism. You had a lot of socialist mayors, in cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, in working class towns throughout the what we now call the sort of Rust Belt corridor. And that sort of is an important fact shaping prohibition, as is, importantly, women's suffrage. Because, of course, there's a close relationship between women's suffrage and the temperance prohibition movement. The idea of bringing a woman's sort of moral sense into politics is all infused in the suffrage movement. And so whether you're trying to sort of defang the suffragettes or whether you're in favor of giving them the vote, pushing the state in that direction is very important. But as I suggested throughout this discussion, progressivism, if you think of its laundry list of concerns, is basically frustrated. And it's frustrated by a number of factors, one of which I'll come back to in a moment, are simply legal constraints. What can the federal government do constitutionally? There's also, as I think I've made clear, this ongoing tension between the idea of reforming society and the idea of just making it more efficient and orderly, between the small p progressive and the conservative elements of the progressive movement. And then, of course, as is the case, as will be the case again a generation later, the outbreak of a world war brings the reform movement to a grinding halt. Now, in some respects, the war feeds into progressive goals because it gives the federal government dramatic new power, but only temporarily. And because the war coincides with the Russian Revolution and fears of sort of importing radicalism, there's a sort of post-war backlash, what we commonly call the Red Scare, which again contributes to a sort of narrowing of reform possibilities at the end of the war and immediately after. But coming back to those legal constraints, it's important to then go back to the Commerce Clause and the legal discussions surrounding it during the Progressive era. Because what's interesting about the Progressive era is that social reformers, political reformers, labor reformers, time and time again identified precisely the same issues that the New Dealers would identify a generation later, but they almost always lost in the court. So in Lochner v. New York in 1905, an attempt to limit the hours in bakery is thrown out by the Supreme Court on the quite understandable grounds that bakeries don't cross state lines. It's up to the state of New York if they want to limit hours, but the federal government should have nothing to do with it. Similarly, the progressives were, or many progressives were fascinated with the prospect of regulating out-of-existent child labor. And one of the efforts to do that was a short-lived federal law which prohibited the shipment of goods produced by children across state lines. But again, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, where those goods are produced, those factories do not cross state lines. The goods may cross state lines, but that's not our concern. Our concern is the conditions under which they're produced. And if they're done by workers working under unsafe conditions, by children, by people working long hours, that's for the state to regulate. It's important, but it's not a federal responsibility. Any questions? The 1920s. I think the 1920s can best be thought of as sort of simultaneously a confirmation of the progressive movement in a small way, but a rejection of it in perhaps a slightly larger way. What retreats in the 1920s, and particularly after the sort of federal innovations of World War I, where the federal government for a time runs the railroads, controls production, as is not surprisingly in a time of war, there's a real backlash against that, a real retreat from that in 1920. The Republicans come into power. They retreat from many of Wilson's sort of dreams of a democratic world built on free trade and say, no, we can do it much more simply with a modest federal government, let markets run themselves, and indeed, after a bit of a post-war dip in the business cycle, the 1920s, as the name suggests, do roar. They don't roar for everybody, but it's generally a boom era. A boom largely driven by the introduction of new consumer goods, most remarkably the automobile. So you have sort of emblematic products like the automobile, which sort of symbolize the new consumer economy, but it's also an economy built on new methods of advertising, on new methods of consumer credit, on new ways of marketing goods to consumers, the emergence of the modern department store, for example. All of these are developed through the 1920s, shifting the economy in a sense from a booming economy based on the production of producer goods, like steel and railroad cars, to a booming economy based on the production of consumer goods, automobiles, railroads, radios, washing machines. It was also an era marked by dramatic demographic shifts, particularly the Great Migration of African Americans north, which begins in the World War I era, continues through the 1920s, slows a little bit during the Depression, and then takes off again during World War II. It's also, as I suggested earlier, an era of racial anxieties. We see the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, not just in the South, but in the Midwest as well. Dramatic restrictions on new immigration, again, out of a fear of, assimilation, radicalism, economic competition, the sort of familiar anxieties that accompany an immigration debate. And it was an era, I would say, in which public policy was largely shaped around an assumption of deferring to the business community. Again, the basic premise of democratic capitalism is that you defer to markets because markets do a good job of organizing resources and employment and investment. And indeed, one of the major concerns of this era, of the 1920s, perhaps best represented by Iowa's Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce from 1920 to 1928 and then President 28 to 32, was a fascination with efficiency. So what Hoover was interested primarily is working with business firms to overcome information problems, standardizing products, things like that. So it's in the 1920s, for example, that Hoover's Department of Commerce goes to the lumber industry and says, why don't we standardize sizes? Why doesn't everyone sell a 2x4 instead of every lumber company selling wood that's slightly different size? Why don't we share prices among each other, share the cost of production, all geared towards sort of more efficient, information-driven system of competition. It was an interesting sort of turn on the problem because we think about that information problem as one in which, the market is trying to hide information from consumers and workers. But in this case, we're talking about information among firms in aid of greater efficiency. This deference to market, of course, extended to labor relations as well. The labor movement grows dramatically during World War I, more than doubling in size, and then loses most of its gains in the first 3 years after the war. There are huge strikes in 1919, an industry-wide strike in steel, a general strike in Seattle, a huge police strike in Boston, almost all of which workers lose. Do you have your hand up or just resting your pen? Okay. I thought you had a question. This is what employers call the open shop movement or the American plan. Putting the emphasis, again, going back to that sort of basic rights-based argument between workers and companies, going back to sort of property rights notion that employers should be free to sign contracts with individual workers. Whereas, of course, the union perception was that no, that democracy was sustained by the ability of workers to join together and form democratic organizations in the workplace. Two sort of dramatically conflicting takes on the same fundamental American principles. It was not an era of sort of unremitting war against labor. Many firms during this period experimented with what observers called welfare capitalism. That is the idea of granting more expansive benefits at work, both to deal with the sort of real problems that progressives had identified, pensions, unemployment, health benefits, that sort of thing, but also, quite consciously, to keep the state at bay. That is, if employers provide these basic benefits, or leading employers do, the state will see less reason to step in because the market has failed. And it was an era of renewed protectionism, a sort of selective protectionism. The Republican administrations of the 1920s try and they want to have the free trade both ways. Because they want to try and open up the world to American firms that need to export, but they want to try and protect American markets as well. And it's a hard game to play. As you can see by this sort of contemporary cartoon, it ends up with a feeling that, American goods are piling up behind trade barriers, and by the same token, American manufacturers can't get the basic raw materials they need in order to succeed. The dilemma for Republicans, or for the Republican administrations of the 1920s, is that the American consumer market is so attractive to everybody. And so to open up foreign markets to American goods also meant opening up the American market to foreign producers. And that was a more difficult move to make. And of course, not an uncommon problem across the 20th century. And of course, it's a decade that ends very badly, with the stock market crash in 1929. It's important to recognize, that the crash occurs as a result of the sort of, short-sightedness of markets that we saw in the recent housing bubble, the fact that you can chase profits in sort of speculative investments without adding to productive capacity or without actually producing goods. But it's also important to note that, the crash reflected some sort of fundamental dilemmas of the economy of the 1920s. The fact that as the labor movement collapsed, wages failed to grow, so you have this growing consumer economy, but consumers don't have any more money in their pocket. In fact, inequality grows during the 1920s. And there's also, of course, the dilemma of trade, that you reach a point in the 1920s when further growth is going to depend on reaching foreign market, and tariff policy won't allow that to happen. Any questions? The economy crashes in 1929. Herbert Hoover is president for 3 more years. The Roosevelt administration takes office in 1932 and begins, after fits and starts, a period of what is, for our purposes, a fairly important pattern of policy innovation. Important because it sort of dramatically changes the landscape of federal responsibilities, and it becomes the benchmark against which public policy is measured for, the rest of the 20th century and what we have of the 21st. That is, building upon or dismantling the New Deal garners much of the attention of policymakers in both parties. Roosevelt doesn't come into office with the notion that he will remake the world. The New Deal is not something the administration campaigns upon. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Roosevelt's initial policies in early 1932 were more cautious than those of Hoover. He tries to balance the federal budget, lay off public sector workers, tightens free trade, trying to protect American manufacturers. It's only after he's in office for a while that he's sort of, bombarded with pressures and ideas, and he begins to sort of innovate. And this cartoon sort of suggests the range of things. So bank program, farm bills, more jobs, curb speculation, relief, et cetera, et cetera. Not an unfamiliar list, even 70 years later. So what does the New Deal do? First, as a first order of business, there's a tangle of new financial regulation. Overcoming, again, that problem we identified last day, the short-sightedness of market. The idea of regulation not as a way of displacing markets, but of making them work better, of saving them from their own tendency towards, sort of speculation, short-sighted speculation. So this included not only banking reforms, the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, of insuring individual bank accounts, the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the stock market. A range of reforms animated really by many of the same motives that animated the end of the Bush term and the beginning of the Obama term, in the sense that if you wanted recovery across the economy, you had to get recovery in the financial sector first, because that's where the investment was. And so again, that's where the initial attention comes. And that's where Hoover had spent much of his attention as well. Next, the administration moves to an attempt to regulate industry. And this is quite candidly an attempt to build on Hoover's effort. The National Recovery Administration, passed in 1933, is an elaborate system of codes of fair competition, where you get industry leaders in a room, you say, what are your prices, what are your costs, what do you pay your workers? Let's come to an agreement. With the idea that they would, in an industry, strike a deal that would, say, cut the hours of work to spread the work among more available workers. That they would agree on a wage, so they would stop competing on wages. That they would agree on prices, so that they would stop sort of cutthroat pricing where no one was making a profit. It's an elaborate exercise, and it's, I will say, a spectacular failure. The federal government doesn't have anywhere near the capacity it needs to run this. Some industries take advantage of it. Some industries ignore it entirely. And, as we'll come back to in a moment, the Supreme Court throws it out in 1935 on Commerce Clause ground. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let me sort of capture some of the other major New Deal initiatives. Following the collapse of the NRA effort in 1935, the New Deal moves in a different direction. This is a moment often called the Second New Deal, beginning in 1935. And the first order of business is federal protection of workers' rights, the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, or what we often call the Wagner Act. For the first time, the federal government says workers have the right to choose their own representatives and to engage in collective bargaining with their employers. And the federal government then protects that right by providing arbitration, by penalizing employers for unfair labor practices and the like. Alongside this, and the other sort of landmark of the Second New Deal, was the Social Security Act, which was a sort of catch-all of a number of major social programs passed by the New Deal. So today we think of Social Security primarily as the old age pension program, but that's sort of one of 6 or 7 major programs in the original Social Security Act. One was aid to mothers with dependent children, what we used to call welfare, aids to the disabled, to the blind. Again, very much animated by the need to pick up after market failure. Who do we expect not to participate in the labor market? Well, those who are unable, the disabled or the blind, those who shouldn't be working, women with children. That was the notion of the day. So the idea then is to, again, to sort of mop up after markets and provide a federal safety net that would sort of put a floor under family income. Now, importantly, taken together, the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act were meant both as relief measures, because people were suffering greatly during the Great Depression, but they were also seen as recovery measures. Because this is the move to what economists would begin to call the demand side, that where you have political innovation, political intervention at the bottom of the economy. You provide support for workers, things like minimum wage, collective bargaining rights, not simply as a relief measure, but so that they have money in their pockets, they can spend money, and the benefits trickle up. It's meant as a way of jump-starting the economy. For those of you who go see Robert Reich speak on next Tuesday night, that's very much his view, and his latest book is about how we need that kind of program again. You recall, well, you may not recall, but President Bush in the wake of 9/11, one of his pronouncements was that everyone should just go buy something, and that's sort of same basic idea of kickstarting the economy. The idea, woven through more contemporary policy debates of periodic tax rebate are meant to provide that sort of catalyst, because the assumption is that they'll be spent and the benefits will contribute to the economy as a whole. The New Deal also innovated on the agricultural side, and here its innovations are cognizant of a number of problems. One, going back to the problem identified by the populists, was that you have an asymmetry in agricultural markets. You have many, many buyers, or many sellers, that is the farmers, but very few buyers. So you need to regulate prices. You need a system by which you can manage production. The characteristic problem you have if there are many, many sellers and only a few buyers is that the sellers will increase production in the hope of getting more of the market. The price will go down, so they'll increase production even more. And that's the pattern of agricultural prices, which collapsed over the period from the end of the Civil War into the 1920s. So agriculture programs are designed to overcome concentrations of power, the sort of information asymmetries in the market, because farmers should know what other farmers are selling their goods for. They're also designed to overcome short-sightedness. You have the institution of sort of rudimentary environmental programs, soil conservation programs, for example. Because again, an individual farmer left to her or his own devices would plant hedgerow to hedgerow, fence row to fence row, the same crop, exhausting the soil in the long term in the hope of reaping some sort of profit in the short term. The New Deal also invests dramatically in public works. Again, public goods, infrastructure. In this case, building not just roads, urban highways, huge hydroelectric developments, the most famous being the Tennessee Valley Authority. Here again, you have, an interesting and important debate because many of the opponents of the Tennessee Valley Authority claim that it's not a public good, that this is something the market will provide, that the government is competing unfairly with private power companies. And many of the public works are on a very small scale. Walk through any town in the continental United States, and you see WPA projects, the Minnesota Fairgrounds, for example. When the level of Lake McBride fell, I think 5 years ago, they discovered all these little stone bridges that had been built in the 1930s. A lot of work is done developing national parks, building picnic shelters, building gymnasiums for high schools, that sort of thing. Again, with the idea of just sort of kickstarting the economy. What's animating this, of course, is not only the desire to produce public goods, but to produce them on a scale and at a pace which will snap the economy around. So this was what we would now call stimulus, right? Counter-cyclical spending. You spend money you don't have in the hope of knocking the bottom out of the business cycle. So, here with the sort of gradual acceptance of the ideas of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, that government should engage in this kind of spending, that is, spend money during the downturn of the business cycle and then collect it during the upturn, is really, marks the origin of, what is very much a sort of ongoing and current debate about the appropriate role of government. I mean, there is, the lingering sort of Keynesian view, best represented by the Obama administration stimulus plans, that you pump money into the economy during bad times. But there's also the view that government in bad times should behave like a household in bad times. It should tighten its belt, lay off public sector workers, grow smaller. As it earlier is, the New Deal has its share of frustration. First and foremost among these, I think, is the fact that for all its innovation, the New Deal doesn't have a dramatic impact on the Depression. It has an impact on the way in which people experience the Depression. That is certainly, the relief programs are important, share the work programs, wage support programs are a tremendous amount of help. But they don't have the desired result, which is to bring about economic recovery. And once Roosevelt's been in office for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and you still have a recession, you can imagine the tenor of the national debate. It's a combination of factors. Of course, because the government controls the money supply, it gets it from its back pocket and puts it in its front pocket. That is, it just changes it's in effect changing the value of the currency. It's not a big concern at that particular time because recessions are generally periods of deflation. But normally you dramatically expand the money supply, you worry about its effect on pricing. But that's not a worry when the economy is flat on its back. The New Deal is also cognizant of the fact that in order to engage in sort of large-scale countercyclical spending, you do need a revenue source. And this is one of it's a good question because this is one of the real dilemmas of the New Deal. Because in the Keynesian model, you have a business cycle, and the idea is when times are good, you collect money. When times are bad, you spend it. Well, it's sort of hard to start when times are bad. because you don't have the money collected, right? And so it's really sort of betting against the future. There are a number of efforts by the New Deal to dramatically raise taxes. But the taxing authority of the federal government is uncertain. The federal income tax, which was inaugurated in 1913, is a pretty minor source of revenue. The government's, the other principal source of revenue is tariff, but the government doesn't want to raise tariffs because it'll make strangle trade anymore because it'll make the Depression worse. So in fact, at the core of your question is this dilemma of the New Deal. They don't spend enough money to make a difference. So it seems, it seems to many at the time, and I think it's a fair assessment, that either you don't engage in countercyclical spending, you tighten your belt, you ride it out, and hope the market will reverse, or you do and you spend enough. But a half measure where you're not collecting the money, you're spending a little bit, is you're just doomed. Because you run huge deficits to no palpable benefit. And that's sort of what happened. The economy takes a severe dip again in 1937, which Roosevelt's opponents gleefully named the Roosevelt recession. And the tenor of national debate is very much that the New Deal is preventing us from snapping out of this. It's not a recovery measure, but it's the anchor on the economy. Very much echoing the tenor of debate today, I think, about the stimulus particularly. The New Deal is also torn by a problem that's basically within the Democratic Party, which is very nicely captured by this cartoon. The Democratic Party is the donkey, of course, and here half of it is sat down. The half that's sitting down is the South. The Democratic Party, as one political scientist described it a little bit later, was at the time one half Sweden, one half South Africa. That is, it was this sort of northern, urban liberals interested in labor reform and social programs, and it was the Jim Crow South interested in maintaining segregation. And the South was in a very peculiar position during the Great Depression because it was the poorest region of the country, and it needed these federal programs more than any other region, and in fact lobbied hard for most of them. But it also feared federal programs more than any other region, because with federal money, with federal programs, of course, came the specter of the Bill of Rights and an end to Jim Crow. So most of the New Deal programs were, in interesting and often innovative ways, crafted to satisfy the South, usually by allowing states to decide what the eligibility standards were or who the covered workers were. So you have these famous exemptions. In the Wagner Act, for example, agricultural and domestic workers are excluded, taking care of the South. In Social Security, states can decide what the eligibility levels are, and they can decide different eligibility levels for black and white citizens, which most of them do. So it's a mistake to think of the New Deal as a sort of expansive federal intervention. There's a lot of federal money, there's a federal framework of laws, but then it's handed off to the state. Then, of course, what happens is that labor unions, civil rights groups, and others say, wait a minute, I just got a check from the federal government, or I'm participating in this federal program, and it's segregated, or African Americans are getting paid less. What's going on here? So you begin to get challenges to the New Deal on equal protection grounds. And the South sits down. Oh, we've had enough of federal intervention because we know where this is headed. It's going to mean voting rights. It's going to mean the ability of African Americans to escape sharecropping and low-wage agriculture. It's going to mean, an end to our way of life. So by the end of the 1930s, the opposition to the New Deal is composed of fiscally conservative Republicans and racially conservative Democrats, or segregationist Democrats. And they pretty much bring the reform movement to a halt. So we begin to see, again, in clear echoes of contemporary politics, notions that Roosevelt administration has gone too far. It's equated at the time both with the fascist movements that are arising in Europe, but also with socialist experiments in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. Sometimes this is linked to the scope of intervention in the economy. Sometimes it's linked merely to the amount of power that's being accumulated in the executive branch, that it's sort of dictatorial. And finally, the New Deal runs into really significant legal problems. I'll talk a little bit about the cases in a moment, because the Commerce Clause is really redefined by the end of the 1930s. But what happens, let me flip to those. Keep this cartoon in the back of your head. What happens in 1935 is that the Supreme Court looks at the National Recovery Administration, which tries to set all these meticulous rules for business. And in a case brought by a small poultry processing firm in New York, says, no, this is not interstate commerce. The federal government cannot set working conditions, wages, hours of work, prices, standards of competition. It's none of its business. This is for the state. Under the Commerce Clause, the NRA is declared invalid. So what Roosevelt proposes in one of the most spectacular political gaffes in modern history is a reform of the Supreme Court. He basically gets up and says, well, you know, there's 9 justices and some of them are pretty old, so I'm going to appoint 5 new ones. So we'll have 14. Clearly, to Roosevelt, to his advisors, to his opponents, the goal is to overturn the Schechter decision, to turn the Commerce Clause around and validate New Deal programs. This, of course, comes amidst all of the growing opposition because the Depression is sticking around, because the South is worried about the effects of the New Deal, and there's just a firestorm. I mean, you can imagine in any political setting, I mean, today, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, what would happen if the president said, you know, I'm going to dramatically change the composition of the court. I'm going to dramatically change another branch of government. It would be like, you know, saying, I'm going to eliminate 50 seats in Congress. You know, not for partisan reasons, but it has the same effect. So, but, you know, Roosevelt, in a sense, lucks out in a way he doesn't deserve. Because for all the firestorm about the plan to pack the court, they eventually back off the plan completely, but then there are sort of strategic or convenient retirements and new appointments, so that by the time the next case comes around, challenging the Wagner Act in NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin, the decision goes 5-4 the other way. And the Supreme Court says in 1937, you know, when you think about it, everything crosses state lines. Workers might move from one state to another to get a higher wage. Workers might live in one state, work in another. Workers might cross the state line to buy something. It's a national economy. It's not confined to the states. Everything in the economy, in one way or another, moves in interstate commerce. This dramatically expands what the federal government can do. It validates the Wagner Act. It validates Social Security. Turns the Commerce Clause, in effect, inside out. And lays the legal foundation for, you know, basically the next 60 years of public policy. Capped in 1942 by the case Wickard v. Filburn, which is the challenge, one of many challenges to the agricultural reforms of the New Deal. This is an interesting case, and it's the one that most often is brought up in the context of health reform today. In Wickard v. Filburn, the farmer in question had been given by the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the New Deal administration, a quota as to how much wheat he could grow or should grow. And he exceeded his quota. The excess, however, he kept on the farm and fed to his chicken. And so the argument is, here's my Agricultural Adjustment Act quota. It's flowing into interstate commerce. I've met the conditions of the program. But surely I can grow more on my own for my own uses. But the court says no. You can't. Because it's affecting the amount of wheat that's in circulation. It's all entering one way or another into interstate commerce. This decision, of course, comes during the war when federal power has expanded fairly dramatically. There's, less of a tendency on the part of the court to check federal power in the context of wartime, and it's really sort of a sort of capstone to the New Deal. People want a break? Yes? If anybody wants a break, we'll take 5 minutes. Okay? We'll take 5 now and then come back and finish this up. Yeah. Let me turn this off. Broadcast this conversation. Okay. Pushing ahead then. Going back to the question earlier about, the sort of dilemma of countercyclical spending, the New Deal is, in a sense, saved by World War II, because if World War II does anything, it pushes the economy to a level of spending that snaps it out of its funk, brings full employment pretty dramatically. Of course, full employment on the back of really dramatic increases in government spending. And so we're talking in the war a level of government spending that is tenfold what we saw in the New Deal. So this is the point where the sort of Keynesian idea of shocking the economy out of its doldrum finally kicks in. The war, in a sense, caps the New Deal in other ways. It sort of seals and cements many of the basic programs of the New Deal, particularly on a labor relations side. So we can see, so here's the passage of the Wagner Act. You can see dramatic growth comes largely through the war years. But unlike the World War I era, labor unions don't drop off immediately after the war because you have those basic collective bargaining agreements in place. During the war years and shortly after, and we move on to the sort of post-war era, you also see a consensus develop around Social Security. There's not much dissent, Republican or Democrat, about the sort of the basic virtue of the old age pension system through the 50s, 60s, and even well into the 1970s. And, perhaps most dramatically, the war sees a dramatic growth in the size of government. So here we have government spending, and you can see the sort of dramatic increase. So here's the New Deal increase on this line, and here's the war increase. And it doesn't come down. So even as we move into the post-war period, the government is spending at rates 3-4 times what the New Deal had contemplated. A combination of social programs, transfer programs, military programs, and infrastructure development. We do see in the post-war period something of a backlash. There is a retreat from the more expansive notion of the Wagner Act, and in a sense a sort of retreat from the Commerce Clause idea, or the expansive idea of the Commerce Clause. The Taft-Hartley Act, passed in 1947, allows states to sort of bail out of the Wagner Act. And this is where you have the institution now in 24 states, I think, of right-to-work laws that say, no, the Wagner Act is not really fully operational in this state. You can sign individual contracts. And so state by state, there's a sort of retreat. And the right-to-work laws tend to pass in states where labor at the time is not particularly important or powerful. So it passes across the South, through the mountain states, through some of the upper Midwest. Iowa is a right-to-work state. Another sort of marked difference and characteristic of the post-war era is that it's really largely shaped by the United States' engagement with the world. The war, among other things, sort of thrusts to the forefront again the Wilsonian ideal of building prosperity on the back of international and free trade. And of course, the United States is in a position to maintain such a system at the end of the war through the Marshall Plan assistance to war-devastated Europe, through its leadership of NATO, of the International Monetary Fund, of the World Bank, of the United Nations. There's a whole tangle of international institutions in which the United States is at the forefront and which are largely designed to sustain this marriage of free markets and free politics, not only in the United States, but around the world. The recognition that that will sustain American prosperity better than anything else. Of course, that's not a global project that is necessarily an easy one. And it comes in confrontation with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc's very different idea of how politics and markets are combined. That is, very little freedom in either. And that in turn shapes American politics. We have another Red Scare, we call the McCarthy period. which in a sense sort of chills reform energies in some respect. Captured by the famous Herb Block cartoon of, McCarthy putting out the fire in the torch of the Statue of Liberty. It's an era also marked by dramatic changes in the shape and the distribution of the population. This is an era, the baby boom, the suburban boom. What happens in effect is is another set of New Deal programs, which we didn't really talk about in the context of the 1930s. The housing programs really kick in when people have money in their pocket. So the basic idea of federal mortgage insurance, allowing people of ordinary means to own a home and pay it off in 30 years with federal backing, or federal backing at least for the bank's risk, takes off in the 1940s and 1950s. So you get this sort of sprawling suburbanization of American cities, dramatic increases in the population in higher education and universities on the back of the GI Bill, dramatic investments in what we might call sort of public capital, higher education especially. As with the post-World War I era, it's another consumer boom. This one sort of exaggerated by the fact that it's coming not only on the heels of a war, but on the heels of a decade of economic recession. And so families sort of reforming in the years after the war, are not only popping out babies famously, but, they're buying homes. They're filling those homes with goods. They're, buying 2 automobiles. They're responding to the advertising revolution that comes with the introduction of the television. A similar sort of pattern as we saw in the 1920s. And the post-war era, this booming era, sees, again, dramatic investments in public goods, in infrastructure, most notably the interstate highway system, which sees the building not only of the sort of basic interstate infrastructure, but the building of regional highways, the sort of beltways that go around cities as well. Most of those are built with 90% federal money during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. With this affluence, which occurs, as we saw, with fairly dramatic federal presence in the economy, comes a conviction by the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 1960s that we can perhaps return to the New Deal and expand upon it. And so in the administrations of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, we have what Johnson liked to call the idea of the Great Society. We can have it all. We can expand the New Deal programs. Who's left behind by the New Deal? There's a sort of rediscovery of poverty, particularly urban poverty. And so you get a period of urban renewal, of public housing, of new urban programs, where the federal government often leapfrogs the states and provides aids directly to cities. There's more generally a sort of rediscovery of poverty, of the notion that, the New Deal, the affluence of the 1940s and 50s, was not a tide that raised all boats, but you have pockets of poverty in cities, in undeveloped rural areas. And, perhaps the best example of attempts to address that is the passage in 1965 of Medicare and Medicaid. This is a sort of classic example of, an effort to dovetail public programs with the market. Because as it's developed into the middle 1960s, health insurance in the United States has developed largely as an employment-based model. That is, people get, or workers get, health insurance for themselves and their families through their place of employment. And so what the market does not do in that instance, and where the state steps in, is they says, well, who doesn't get health care from their employers? Workers at the very bottom of the labor market, the very poor, those who have not much attachment to the labor market. So we get Medicaid, the federal state sort of hybrid program of health care for the very poor. And who else doesn't get health care? Well, those who exit the labor market upon retirement. So we get Medicare. Again, the idea of to sort of dovetail market-based and politically based or public policies. There's also a dramatic increase in federal aid to education during this period at all levels. And so you get the community action programs, which do sort of preschool. You get investments in K through 12 education, and there's a boom both in federal and state spending on public universities as well. Also importantly, of course, in terms of rounding out the New Deal, is the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, which we can think of not so much as the establishment of new programs, but as a series of legal decisions and political commitments which make those programs available to citizens, to all citizens, that basically sort of break down the final bastions of the Jim Crow system in the South, removing, local, state-level restrictions on property, on voting rights, on access to welfare, and the like. And then finally, I would say this era is marked by the discovery of what we called last day externality, the environment. Problems the market creates but is not really designed to deal with. And so, and this actually culminates in the Nixon administration in the early 1970s when you have the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. These, interestingly, fall back on an older notion of federal power because, the federal government's in a position to argue that, after all, water and air do cross state lines. And so these fall under a sort of older definition of federal power. But again, this is a reform period marked by frustration as well. Part of that comes with the sort of partisan realignment that is beginning to occur. Until the early 1970s, there were no Republicans elected south of the Mason-Dixon line. None. Zero. It was a one-party region. With the exception of the period of Reconstruction, the sort of forced Reconstruction after the Civil War. It was an era in which democratic and largely white segregationist democratic rule prevailed. But that begins to unravel as the federal government, first with the New Deal, then with World War II, then with the Great Society programs, makes more and more inroads into local politics. Republicans become the party that is seen as sort of checking the ambitions of the New Deal, and become more attractive to Southerners who are also interested, for some of the same and for some different reasons, in checking the ambitions of the New Deal. So the Republican Party, as this cartoon suggests, begins finally to enter the South. Now, much of Southern politics remains dominated by the older model of very conservative Republicans inside the Democrat, or very conservative Democrats, rather, inside the Democratic Party, but that also starts to bleed into Republican control as well, a process which continues to the present day. This was an era also bedeviled by, fiscal limits, by the difficulty of having it all. Largely because, the Johnson administration somewhat blindly plows into these ambitious political commitments at the same time as it's pumping money into a war in Vietnam that is going nowhere, to the point where something has to give. And so the late 1960s are marked more by this fiscal reckoning, by, the upheaval, the urban riots that run from 65 through 68, the pitched battles in Chicago during the Democratic Convention of that year, are all, I think, symptomatic of this moment at which, in one respect, there's an effort to build dramatically on the example of the New Deal. But in other respect, there are conditions which are making that impossible and which are actually creating powerful forces in opposition to that vision, that particular vision of public policy. And the most dramatic of those, I think, is the collapse of post-war growth. The economy simply stops growing at the rate that it had from 47 to 1972 or 73. There's a severe dip in the early 1970s. We can see here. What's interesting is, you look at this, the dip that's marked by this sort of yellow box here, and it was marked by, widespread political panic. The era of growth has come to an end. What do we do? And of course, things are worse and in some respects more volatile afterward. Look how dramatic the decline, the budgetary problems are following that. But this moment at which the United States began routinely running budget deficits, began routinely running trade deficits, was a real reckoning. It marked the sort of end of that moment of American leadership and sort of unalloyed American prosperity. And, it gives us the origins of, I think, the current political alignment, which I would characterize as a conservative ascendant, as a skepticism about the politics of the New Deal, about its ability to sustain economic growth. Part of that logic, of course, rests on dramatically changing conditions. There is a sort of widespread perception that globalization is going to make something like, an egalitarian project like the New Deal more difficult. Because, it is true that during that period from 47 into the early 70s, when the United States outstripped everybody in terms of growth, that's because a lot of countries were playing catch-up. Germany and Japan, much of Western Europe were recovering from the war. Emerging economies in Asia and elsewhere, were not yet at that stage of development. But once we reach the 1980s and 1990s, there's lots of competitors out there. Lots of countries that can manufacture goods, and lots of them can do it much cheaper than the United States. So there's a continued sort of fiscal crisis, an inability to maintain the level of spending, the level of government intervention, the level of control over the economy, reflected in these, characteristic magazine covers from the middle 1970s. Ongoing economic woe. Captured by, the recognition by economists of this new index, where they would, you stack together the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment. And for the first time in this period, you begin to get both at high levels at the same time. And the conventional wisdom used to be that you could bring unemployment down by spending money. So inflation, but full employment. Or if you controlled the money supply, you might slow down the economy, you'd have no inflation and high unemployment. But now all of a sudden you have both, which economists, until it happened, didn't even think it could happen. And the consensus, powerfully on the Republican side, but gradually in much of the sort of center Democratic side as well, is that labor costs are too high in the United States. There's a backlash against organized labor. There's a period of what becomes known as concessionary bargaining, where workers get lower wages when they go to the bargaining table just in exchange for keeping their jobs for a few more years. Cuts in benefits. All sort of animated by the threat that high-wage industry can always go elsewhere. It can go from New Jersey to Louisiana. It can go from Louisiana to Mexico. It can go from Mexico to Malaysia. And so we see this sort of dramatic drop in union membership, or what's union density. And so, as late as 1973, about a quarter of all workers belong to union. Falls off, this only goes to 1997, continues following after that. But almost all of the collapse is from the private sector. And as of numbers that were released last week, the majority of union members in this country are now public sector workers. Union density in the private sector is something like 7%, from a high of 45% circa 1950, 1955. It's a fairly dramatic change over the course of a relatively short period of time. Alongside this conviction that the cost of doing business must be brought down, there's a retreat in social policy, a view that expansive social programs cannot be afforded. The first hints of reforming Social Security, the long and sort of painful collapse of what we used to call welfare, aids to families with dependent children, which begins first by giving many of those programs back to the states, with what Nixon and later presidents called a sort of renewed federalism, but pushing the responsibility back on the states, and then gutting the program entirely or getting rid of it entirely in 1996 during the Clinton administration. We also see in this era the beginnings of tax revolts, which of course continue in different ways to the present day. The most famous example, and the earliest one, Proposition 13 in California, which stopped the growth in property taxes and dramatically changed the way in which California could pay for public goods, public services, particularly education, which relied heavily on property taxes. And I think, given the importance of, given the sort of background importance to policy of maintaining economic health, what we also see is a certain degree of political volatility and a sort of collapse of faith in political institutions and political leaders. Much more of a sort of throw the bums out attitude every election. Nobody can accomplish it. A sort of swing from one party to the other of the like that we hadn't seen earlier in the 20th century. All of which, of course, is exaggerated by the Watergate scandal of the middle 1970s, which I don't think is the primary cause of this disenchantment. I think it lies in the economic conditions, but it certainly exaggerates it. And I think what we see during this conservative era is both a starker confrontation between political factions and political parties, but also a general movement to the right on the part of both. So the Clinton Democrats, for example, came out of a movement in the 1970s and 80s, which was an effort to sort of divest the Democratic Party of its strong allegiance to organized labor, to allow the Democrats to sort of lower business costs as well. They called themselves the New Democrat, which of course some viewed, sarcastically as a situation where the parties were now both in the hands of corporate America. Almost a return to that, sort of Gilded Age anxiety. It's very similar, to Rockefeller's Standard Oil running the world. And as I suggested, this is an era marked by, I think, a renewed interest in the Commerce Clause as a check on federal power. After the 1942 case that we talked about earlier, there's not a single significant challenge to expansive federal power under the Commerce Clause until the middle 1990s. United States versus Lopez, the Supreme Court strikes down a state-level law, a guns-free school law, which banned this was a sort of federal law that banned guns in schools on the grounds that that wasn't interstate commerce. That was for the states to regulate, which is the first time that the federal government had sort of had its hand slapped in that respect since the New Deal. The federal government wanted to get guns out of schools, off school property entirely, using as their leverage federal aid to education. So if you receive federal money, you have to respect the federal ban. And what the court said was, Yeah, we have no argument with keeping guns out of schools, but that's the state's business. The federal government can't do it because it's not specified under the Commerce Clause as a federal responsibility. And it's not a federal responsibility because nothing's crossing state line. Now, interestingly, in the Gonzalez case in 2005, it tipped the other way. This was a case in which the federal government challenged California's medical marijuana law. So California had a medical marijuana law which allowed, small-scale grow operations and distribution, as long as you had a doctor's prescription. But the DEA kept busting them. So California sued the government saying, this is for the states to decide. But here the Supreme Court said no. This does involve interstate commerce. The drug trade cannot be taken out of the interstate equation. So it's a sort of split view of the Commerce Clause. And then, interestingly, in December, in a case in the district court in Virginia, a district court judge decided that the Obama health care plan was unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause, on the grounds that the federal government could not, under the pretense of regulating commerce, tell people they had to buy something. That wasn't a regulation, it was a compulsion. Now, the same case has been tried in a number of states, 4 or 5 by now, and this is the only one that has forthrightly said this violates the Commerce Clause. But it is an interesting return to that notion of much more modest federal responsibility, and a sort of rediscovery of that earlier notion where you read that part of the Constitution as if it specifically identified what the federal government could do, and everything else was up to the state. Which is where we find ourselves today. I have as a final slide here a sort of elaborate matrix of the basic characteristics of these eras on these different policy things. I don't expect you to look at it now, but this will be posted to the website, and so you can use it as a sort of quick reference. So it gives you a sense, you look at an era and you say, well, what was the economy like? What was the regional patterns like? What was the trade policy? What were its principal concerns with regard to labor, social policy? What does party real alignment look like? And what were the important legal considerations or cases?